Here's exactly what you're going to discover in Joshua's complete story. His secret training under Moses that prepared him for leadership, the spy mission that almost got him killed, the moment God personally commissioned him as Moses' successor, and the supernatural military tactics that conquered 31 kingdoms in just 7 years. We'll explore every major battle, every divine intervention, and every leadership decision that shaped the nation of Israel. From the collapse of Jericho's walls to the day the sun stood still, from his greatest victories to his most costly mistakes, this is the definitive account of the man who transformed a wandering nation into a conquering army. But before we get into it, if you're new to this channel, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribing if you haven't already. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Please introduce yourself. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. It really makes us feel like the global community we really are. Thank you for joining me today. So without further ado, let's dive in, shall we? The Shadow of the Giant, introducing Joshua, son of Nun. Stand in the shadow of greatness long enough and you forget where the shadow ends and you begin. Joshua, son of Nun, lived his entire life in that shadow. Not the shadow of failure or obscurity, but something far more daunting. The shadow cast by a man who spoke with the Almighty face to face, who split seas and brought forth water from stone, who carried the very words of the divine down from mountains wreathed in fire. Moses. The text introduces Joshua almost casually, as though his presence requires no explanation. He appears first as an aide, a servant, a trusted companion. The Hebrew calls him a na'ar, a term that suggests youth, but also service and apprenticeship. He stands beside the prophet not as an equal, but as one learning the weight of leadership through proximity to power. His lineage traces back through the tribe of Ephraim, one of Joseph's sons. This places him within a line blessed by Jacob himself, a tribe destined for prominence in the northern territories. Yet, Joshua's identity comes not from his ancestry, but from his association. He is Moses' assistant. That phrase becomes his title, his introduction to history. Consider what this means. To serve greatness requires a particular kind of strength, the strength to diminish yourself, to let another's light shine while you prepare in the darkness. Joshua never seeks the spotlight during Moses' lifetime. He remains in the background, observing, learning, carrying out commands without question. But proximity to the divine changes a person. Moses bore the burden of leading an entire nation through wilderness and wandering, through complaint and rebellion. Joshua watched it all. He saw the cost of leadership, the loneliness of standing between a holy presence and an unholy people. He witnessed the exhaustion etched into Moses' face after each encounter with the divine, the weight of carrying words too heavy for one man's shoulders. The shadow shaped him. It taught him patience when others demanded action. It showed him humility when others grasped for power. It prepared him for a task he couldn't yet imagine, stepping into the light when the giant finally fell. The name itself carries meaning. Born as Hoshea, meaning salvation, Moses later changes it to Yehoshua, Joshua, meaning the Lord is salvation. This simple addition of the divine name transforms his identity. He becomes not just a man who brings deliverance, but a living declaration that all deliverance comes from above. Think about living with that name. Every introduction becomes a sermon. Every time someone calls you, they speak theology. You can never forget whose work you're doing, whose power you're channeling, whose glory must shine through every victory. Joshua's early life remains largely hidden from the text. We don't know his childhood, his training, his family beyond his father's name. The narrative considers these details unimportant. What matters is his relationship to Moses, his preparation for succession, his gradual transformation from servant to commander. This erasure of personal history serves a purpose. Joshua exists not as an individual pursuing his own ambitions, but as a vessel being prepared for divine work. His story begins not with his birth, but with his calling, not with his desires, but with his duty. The wilderness becomes his classroom. Every miracle Moses performs, Joshua witnesses. Every rebellion the people mount, Joshua observes. Every moment of divine presence manifesting in cloud and fire, Joshua stands near enough to feel the heat, to smell the otherness of holiness intruding into the mundane world. He learns that leadership among this people requires more than military skill or administrative talent. It demands faith that can look at impossibility and see it as merely the canvas for divine action. It requires the ability to stand firm when thousands around you waver, to believe promises when circumstances scream betrayal. The shadow grows longer. Moses ages, his strength undiminished, but his time limited by divine decree. Joshua remains at his side, still the assistant, still the servant. But now whispers begin. Who will lead when Moses is gone? Who can possibly fill those sandals? Who has stood close enough to the fire to carry its heat forward? The answer seems obvious to those who've been watching. Only one man has remained faithful, has served without seeking power, has learned by observing rather than demanding to be taught. Only one man has positioned himself not to seize authority but to receive it when the time comes. Joshua, son of Nun, of the tribe of Ephraim, servant of Moses, the man in the shadow preparing to step into the light, the apprentice who will become the master, the assistant who will become the commander. Not because he sought the role, but because the role sought him. Not because he proved himself worthy, but because faithfulness itself became his worthiness. The giant's shadow stretches across decades. It falls upon a younger man who learns in that darkness how to carry light. The apprentice warrior, Joshua's first battles and divine favor. The Amalekites came without warning, without provocation, attacking from the rear where the weak and weary traveled. This wasn't war as politics. This was predation. The desert breeds hard peoples, and the Amalekites represented the hardest, raiders who struck the vulnerable and vanished into the wilderness before reprisal could come. They saw in the escaped Hebrew slaves not a threat, but an opportunity, a column of refugees ripe for plunder. Moses faced a problem. His people weren't soldiers. They'd been brickmakers, not warriors. They knew the weight of clay and straw, not sword and shield. Yet here came an enemy that understood violence in its purest form, swift, brutal, efficient. The prophet called one name, Joshua. The text offers no explanation for this choice. We receive no account of Joshua's prior military experience, no description of his training or tactical knowledge. Moses simply says, "Choose men for us and go out, fight against Amalek." The command assumes capability, suggests trust built through unseen service. Joshua obeyed. He selected fighters from among the people, organized them into some form of combat unit, and led them out to meet the raiders at Rephidim. The location matters, near the mountain where the divine presence had already manifested, where Moses had struck rock to bring forth water. This ground had witnessed miracles. Now it would witness war. The battle itself unfolds with strange choreography. Joshua engages the enemy below while Moses ascends a hill overlooking the fighting. The aged prophet raises his hands, staff gripped tight, arms extended toward heaven. As long as his hands remain lifted, the Hebrews prevail. When exhaustion forces his arms down, the Amalekites surge forward. Consider what Joshua experienced. Fighting below, pressing the attack, suddenly feeling the tide turn against him for no tactical reason. His formations hold, his men fight with courage, yet something shifts in the battle's momentum. Then, inexplicably, strength returns. The enemy falters. Victory becomes possible again. Only later does he learn the truth. His success depended entirely on an old man's arms remaining raised. Aaron and Hur eventually support Moses, holding his hands aloft until sunset, until Joshua achieves total victory and the Amalekites scatter into the desert. This becomes Joshua's foundational lesson in leadership. Your strength flows from above, not within. Personal courage and tactical skill matter, but they serve merely as channels for divine power. The battle belongs to the Almighty. You simply obey, execute, trust that invisible hands guide the visible sword. The victory establishes Joshua's reputation. He becomes known as Moses' military commander, the man who can translate divine favor into battlefield success. But the lesson cuts deeper than reputation. He's learned that success and failure aren't always connected to his actions. The same tactics, the same courage, the same effort can produce opposite results, depending on factors beyond his control. This could breed despair or passivity. Why try if success depends on someone else's raised arms? But Joshua draws a different conclusion. Faithfulness matters more than results. His task is to fight with everything he possesses, trusting that the outcome rests in hands more capable than his own. The text records something else. After the battle, Moses builds an altar and names it, "The Lord is my banner." Then comes a troubling prophecy. The Almighty will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. This first victory isn't an ending, but a beginning. the opening battle in a conflict that will span centuries. Joshua absorbs this too. The victory at Rephidim, complete as it seems, doesn't solve the problem. Amalek will return, other enemies will rise. The warfare isn't a puzzle to be solved once, but a condition to be managed across time, requiring vigilance and faith in every generation. His role crystallizes. He isn't called to achieve permanent peace. That lies beyond any human commander's reach. He's called to be faithful in his generation, to fight the battles placed before him, to trust that each act of obedience contributes to purposes larger than he can perceive. The apprenticeship continues. Moses writes the victory in a book, ensuring memory persists beyond the participants. Joshua observes this too, how the prophet transforms events into testimony, that how he builds altars that speak to future generations, how he connects each present moment to larger narratives of divine faithfulness. Warfare becomes worship. Strategy becomes service. The military commander learns that his true commanding officer dwells not in any tent, but in the space between heaven and earth, in the realm where raised hands alter battlefield outcomes, where obedience carries more weight than genius. The Amalekites flee, defeated but not destroyed. Joshua returns from his first battle carrying more than victory. He carries the knowledge that every future triumph will require the same formula: human faithfulness channeling divine power, mortal hands wielding immortal strength, a warrior learning to fight with weapons visible and invisible. The apprentice warrior takes his place beside Moses once more. But something has shifted. The servant remains a servant, yet now he's also a proven commander. The shadow still falls across him, but within that shadow, he's discovered his own capacity to carry light into darkness, to bring divine purposes into bloody reality. The Almighty has war with Amalek. Joshua has learned to be his instrument. On the holy mountain, Joshua the guardian in the cloud, the mountain burned with the presence of something beyond naming. Moses prepared to ascend Sinai alone, called upward by a voice that shook stone and made the earth itself seem temporary. The entire nation camped below, forbidden to approach, warned that even a touch upon the mountain's base meant certain termination. Boundaries had been drawn, consequences made clear. But Moses didn't ascend completely alone. The text reveals an unexpected detail. Joshua, his assistant, did not depart from the tent. More specifically, when Moses went up to receive the law, Joshua accompanied him partway. Not to the summit where the divine presence manifested in consuming fire, but to some intermediate station, some waypoint between the earthly camp and the heavenly encounter. This placement carries profound significance. Joshua occupied a space belonging neither to the common people below nor to Moses in the cloud above. He dwelt in the liminal zone, the threshold between ordinary reality and something wholly other. Too high for the camp, too low for the summit, caught between worlds. Think about what this required. The mountain manifested holiness in visible form: thunder, lightning, thick cloud, the sound of trumpet growing louder. The whole mass shook violently. The people trembled at the base, terrified, begging Moses to speak to them instead of letting them hear the divine voice directly. They recognized the danger, understood that proximity to such power could unmake them. Joshua climbed higher, not by his own choice, not through presumption or ambition, but by Moses' decision and implicitly by divine permission. He was brought into the cloud, into the realm where normal rules of existence bent under the weight of holiness. And there he waited. For 6 days, the cloud covered the mountain. On the 7th day, Moses received the call to come higher still, ascending into the fire itself. Joshua remained behind. The text doesn't specify his exact location. Some ledge, some outcropping, some space deemed safe enough for mortal flesh to persist while glory blazed above. 40 days, 40 nights. Moses communed with the Almighty while Joshua maintained his vigil in the cloud. The text offers no description of his experience during this time. Did he eat? Did he sleep? Did he perceive anything of the conversation happening above him? Or did the cloud mercifully shield him from knowledge too heavy for human consciousness to carry? The silence speaks. Joshua's experience goes unrecorded because it wasn't the point. His role was simply to be there, to maintain position, to guard the boundary, even though no human would dare violate it. Faithfulness expressed as patient waiting in a holy place, doing nothing visible yet performing essential service. Consider the discipline this required. Below, the camp went about daily business. cooking, talking, arguing, living. Above, Moses received commandments that would shape nations and centuries. Joshua occupied the empty space between, neither fully part of the world below nor admitted to the summit above. This prepared him for his future role in ways subtle but crucial. Leadership among a covenant people requires the ability to stand between the divine and the human, to wait patiently in uncomfortable spaces, to maintain faithfulness when nothing seems to be happening and no one's watching. The cloud itself becomes significant. In Hebrew thought, the cloud represents the divine presence made visible but not transparent, holiness manifest yet mysterious, close yet inaccessible. Joshua dwelt within this mystery for 40 days, learning through immersion what Moses taught through instruction. He experienced holiness not as concept but as atmosphere, as the very air he breathed. Then came the descent. Moses finished receiving the tablets and began returning to camp, Joshua accompanying him. As they descended, they heard noise from below, singing, shouting, chaos. Joshua's first interpretation revealed his military mind. There is a sound of war in the camp. Moses corrected him. It is not the sound of shouting for victory, nor the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. Joshua, for all his time in the cloud, hadn't yet developed Moses's ability to discern spiritual crisis from physical threat. He heard rebellion but misidentified its nature. They emerged from the cloud to discover the golden calf. While Moses received the law above and Joshua waited in holy space, the people below had corrupted themselves, fashioning an idol and declaring it their deliverer. The contrast couldn't be starker. Transcendent holiness above, base idolatry below, and Joshua occupying the space between, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding in the camp. This too taught him something vital. Proximity to holiness doesn't automatically transfer to those you lead. Joshua could spend 40 days in the cloud, but the people below remained unchanged. Future leadership would require more than personal spiritual experience. It would demand constant vigilance, teaching, correction, and enforcement of boundaries. Joshua descended with Moses into the chaos. He'd entered the cloud as an assistant. He emerged as something more, a man marked by proximity to holiness, who'd learned patience in liminal spaces, who discovered that leadership sometimes means simply maintaining position in uncomfortable territory while waiting for divine purposes to unfold. The guardian in the cloud returned to the broken camp below. The mountains still burned behind them, but ahead lay the harder work of shaping a rebellious people into something capable of receiving the holiness they'd just rejected. The fear of the spies, a minority report of faith. The border of promise appeared before them at last. After more than a year of journeying from bondage through wilderness, the people of the Almighty camped at Kadesh Barnea on the southern edge of Canaan. The land promised to their ancestors stretched north, lush, fertile, flowing with abundance according to every divine assurance. Now came the time to claim it. Moses selected 12 men, one from each tribe, to enter the land secretly and bring back reconnaissance. They received clear instructions. Assess the territory, the cities, the people, the strength of fortifications. Determine if the inhabitants dwell in camps or walled cities. Examine the soil, the vegetation. Bring back samples of the produce. Go, look, and report what you see. Among the 12 walked Hoshea, son of Nun, representing Ephraim. Before sending them out, Moses renamed him from Hoshea, meaning salvation, to Yoshua. The Lord is salvation. This small addition of the divine name transformed his identity at the precise moment he needed it most. He would need to remember whose salvation mattered in the days ahead. The 12 entered Canaan and spent 40 days exploring. They reached as far north as Rehob, traversing the length of the promised territory. In the valley of Eshcol, they cut down a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes so massive it required 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. They gathered pomegranates and figs, tangible proof of the land's fertility. 40 days later, they returned to Kadesh Barnea. The entire congregation assembled to hear their report. The spies displayed the fruits, evidence undeniable that the land produced abundance exactly as promised. Every claim about flowing milk and honey found visual confirmation in that grape cluster, in the richness of the harvest they carried back. Then came the assessments. Yes, the spies confirmed, the land flows with milk and honey. However, the word hung in the air like a blade. However, the people dwelling there are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. More troubling still, they saw the descendants of Anak, giants, men of terrifying size and reputation. The report continued, cataloging dangers: Amalekites in the Negev, Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites in the hill country, Canaanites along the coast and the Jordan. Every direction held enemies. Every territory sheltered peoples known for strength and ferocity. 10 of the 12 spies reached the same conclusion: we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. The assessment seemed reasonable, even obvious. They'd seen the fortifications, measured the opposition, calculated the odds. Simple military logic produced an unavoidable conclusion: conquest was impossible. But the 10 went further. They spread a bad report among the people, transforming objective assessment into demoralizing propaganda. The land devours its inhabitants, they claimed. Everyone we saw there were men of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The sons of Anak come from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we seemed to them. Notice the progression. From accurate observation, yes, there are large people, to catastrophic interpretation, we're grasshoppers. Conquest is suicidal. The spies went in as scouts and returned as prophets of doom, their fear infecting their report until fact and terror became indistinguishable. Two voices spoke differently. Caleb silenced the people before Moses and declared, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Joshua stood with him. These two alone among the 12 issued a minority report grounded not in denying the dangers, but in remembering the promises. The contrast reveals everything. All 12 saw the same cities, the same giants, the same fortifications. All 12 carried back the same evidence of abundance. But 10 focused on obstacles, while 2 focused on the one who'd promised the land. 10 calculated human probability, while 2 remembered divine capability. The congregation sided with the 10. Fear spreads faster than faith. Soon the entire camp was weeping, wailing, muttering rebellion. Would that we had ended in the land of bondage, or would that we had perished in this wilderness. They began discussing the appointment of a new leader to take them back to servitude in the land of their former oppression. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, a gesture of grief and horror. They addressed the congregation with desperate urgency. "The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." The argument came down to one question: whom do you believe? The evidence of fortifications or the word of promise? The size of giants or the presence of the Almighty? Human calculation or divine declaration? The congregation responded by discussing how to stone Joshua and Caleb. The minority report nearly cost them their lives. Only the sudden manifestation of divine glory at the tent of meeting prevented their execution. What followed was judgment. The 10 spies who spread the bad report faced immediate termination. The entire generation of fighting men, all those counted in the census, received sentence. They would wander in the wilderness 40 years, 1 year for each day of spying until their bodies fell in the wasteland. None would enter the promised land except Joshua and Caleb, like the 2 who trusted despite what they'd seen. Joshua watched an entire generation receive their doom. The people who'd witnessed the plagues, who'd walked through the sea on dry ground, who'd seen the mountain burn with holiness, all condemned to slow expiration in the wilderness. Their fear cost them everything. He'd learned something stark: seeing miracles doesn't guarantee faith. You can witness the impossible made possible and still choose fear when the next challenge appears. The congregation had seen wonders, but when giants loomed, wonders meant nothing. Grasshopper thinking prevailed. Joshua survived because he'd learned to see differently, not denying reality, but interpreting it through promise rather than probability. The giants were real. The fortifications were formidable. Conquest would be bloody. All true. Yet none of it mattered compared to one simple fact: the Almighty had promised them the land. The minority report became the true report, but it would take 40 years and an entire generation's passing before anyone else would be ready to believe it. 40 years in the wilderness, the silent preparation. The wilderness doesn't announce its lessons, it grinds them into you, day by day, until endurance becomes identity. Joshua watched an entire generation age and fade around him. The sentence was clear: 40 years of wandering, 1 year for each day the spies had explored Canaan. Everyone who'd been counted in the census, all the men 20 years and older who'd stood at Kadesh Barnea and chosen fear over faith, none would enter the promised land. Their bodies would fall in the wasteland, scattered across decades of slow dissolution. But Joshua survived. He and Caleb alone among their generation received exemption from the judgment. They would live through the dying, witness the long parade of funerals, outlast the very people they tried to save with their minority report. Their reward for faithfulness looked like watching everyone they knew slowly disappear. The text offers almost nothing about these 40 years. A few incidents break the silence: rebellions, plagues, confrontations with neighboring peoples. But mostly we find absence, a great gap in the narrative where Joshua's middle years should be. He enters the wilderness at roughly 40 years old and emerges nearing 80, but the decades between vanish into ellipsis. This silence itself teaches something. Not everything worth doing makes for dramatic storytelling. Sometimes formation happens in the empty spaces, the repetitive days that blend into seasons that blur into years. Joshua's character wasn't forged in spectacular moments, but in the slow accumulation of faithful responses to mundane challenges. Consider what he witnessed. Every funeral reinforced the cost of disobedience, the consequences of choosing fear. Men he'd fought beside at Rephidim, companions from the journey out of bondage, they aged, weakened, and returned to dust without seeing promise fulfilled. The wilderness became a vast cemetery, unmarked graves scattered across its desolation. But he also saw something else: a new generation growing up. The children who'd been too young to be counted at Kadesh Barnea matured into adults who'd never known servitude, who'd been born into freedom, who learned from their parents' failure rather than repeating it. These would be the ones Joshua led across the Jordan. Not the fearful grasshopper thinkers, but their children, forged in wilderness and ready for conquest. Joshua's role shifted during these years. As Moses' generation diminished, Joshua became a bridge figure, old enough to remember the plagues and the sea crossing, young enough to relate to those born during the wandering. He embodied continuity, connecting promise to fulfillment across a gap measured in graves. He watched Moses too. The prophet bore crushing weight, leading a people condemned to wander until they perished, maintaining order and faith among those without hope of personal deliverance, speaking words from the Almighty while knowing he himself would be barred from entering Canaan. Moses' failure at Meribah, striking the rock instead of speaking to it, cost him his inheritance. Even the greatest leader fell short. This shaped Joshua's understanding of leadership's burden. Success wasn't guaranteed even to the most faithful. Mistakes carried consequences. The work mattered more than the worker. Moses would not enter the land, but his mission would succeed through his successor. Pride had no place in this equation. You served, you obeyed, and you trusted that divine purposes would accomplish themselves through you, or, if necessary, through someone else. The wilderness also trained Joshua in patience. 40 years of waiting teaches you that divine timing operates differently than human urgency. The people wanted immediate conquest at Kadesh Barnea. The Almighty required decades of preparation first. What seemed like delay was actually formation, the slow work of raising up a generation capable of faithful obedience. Joshua learned to wait without passivity. The manna still fell, the cloud still guided their movements, the presence still dwelt in the tabernacle. Divine activity continued even during what looked like stagnation. You could be actively waiting, maintaining readiness, preparing for a future whose exact timing remained hidden. Militarily, too, the wilderness provided education. Skirmishes with various peoples, Edomites, Moabites, Amorites, kept Joshua's tactical skills sharp. The victory over Sihon and Og demonstrated that conquest remained possible, that the new generation could fight and prevail. These battles served as rehearsals, building confidence and competence in preparation for Canaan's fortified cities. But perhaps the deepest preparation happened internally. Joshua had to outlive his peers while remaining humble, had to watch promise delayed without growing cynical, had to maintain faith across decades when nothing seemed to be advancing. The wilderness burned away any illusions of self-sufficiency. You survived because the Almighty provided manna, water from rock, clothes that didn't wear out. Your strength came from outside yourself. Always. The years accumulated. The original generation thinned, then vanished. Moses grew old, his vigor undiminished, but his time ending. Joshua remained, not because he was stronger or wiser than those who'd fallen, but because faithfulness mattered more than ability. He'd given the right report at Kadesh Barnea. That single act of trust purchased 40 years of purpose. As the wandering drew toward its close, as the people prepared to approach Canaan's border once more, Joshua stood as one of the last living connections to the generation that had escaped servitude. He remembered the sea crossing. He'd been there when the mountain burned. He'd watched the golden calf and its consequences. He carried memory forward into the future. The wilderness released him, transformed. Not harder, exactly, but refined. The dross of youth burned away. What remained was a man shaped by patient endurance, who had learned that divine timing surpasses human understanding, who discovered that surviving the wait mattered as much as winning the war. The silent years weren't empty. They were full of exactly the lessons Joshua needed, but couldn't have received any other way. The wilderness gave him time to watch, time to learn, time to become the man who could lead a new generation into promises the old generation had forfeited through fear. 40 years, 40 funerals for every day of failed reconnaissance. And at the end, standing beside the Jordan, looking across into Canaan, one old warrior who'd learned to trust, ready at last to lead people who'd learned from their parents' mistakes. The wilderness finished its work. Now came the test. The mantle passes. Commissioning at the tent of meeting. The end approached, and Moses knew it. The prophet stood on the edge of 120 years, his eye undimmed and vigor unabated, yet divine decree barred him from the land he'd spent decades leading people toward. His failure at the waters of Meribah, speaking harshly to the people, striking the rock instead of commanding it, carried consequences even prophetic greatness couldn't erase. He would see Canaan from a distance. He would not walk its soil. Succession required careful handling. This people had known only Moses since their liberation. He'd been their mediator with the divine, their judge, their commander, their lawgiver. His presence had defined them. How do you replace the irreplaceable? The answer came not through popular vote or tribal consensus, but through divine initiative. The Almighty instructed Moses, "Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him." The succession would be enacted publicly, visibly, with ceremony that left no ambiguity about authority's source. Moses brought Joshua to the tent of meeting. Eleazar the priest attended, along with the assembled congregation. This wasn't a private transfer of power, but a public commissioning, witnessed by leadership and people alike. Everyone would see the authority pass, understand the chain of command, recognize who spoke with divine backing. The ritual proceeded. Moses laid his hands on Joshua, a physical gesture transferring more than symbolic authority. The touch connected them, made visible the flowing of mandate from one generation to the next. Moses spoke, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall put them in possession of it." Then came the divine voice, speaking directly to Joshua. This moment marked something unprecedented, the Almighty addressing someone other than Moses while the prophet still lived. "Be strong and courageous." The divine command echoed Moses' words, "For you shall bring the people into the land that I swore to give them. I will be with you." Notice the careful layering. Moses commissioned Joshua before the people, then the Almighty confirmed that commissioning directly. Human authority and divine mandate aligned perfectly. No one could later claim Joshua had seized power or manipulated succession. Both levels of authority spoke clearly. But the commissioning carried warnings too. Joshua received not just authority, but the specific challenge he would face. "The Lord your God himself will go over before you. He will destroy these nations before you. Joshua also will go over at your head, just as the Lord has spoken." The promise came paired with responsibility. Divine presence would go ahead, but Joshua still had to follow, to lead the people into battles whose outcomes depended on faithfulness more than tactics. Moses gave additional instructions, prescribing how leadership should function after his departure. The people should hear the law read regularly, renewing their covenant commitment with each generation. Joshua would lead militarily and administratively, but the priests would maintain religious instruction. Leadership would be distributed, not concentrated in one figure as it had been with Moses. The commissioning also addressed Joshua's internal state. 3 times the command came, "Be strong and courageous," not once, not twice, but repeatedly. This repetition revealed something. The Almighty and Moses both understood the weight of Joshua's task, the natural fear of replacing a legend, the temptation toward inadequacy. Be strong and courageous isn't encouragement to feel brave. It's a command to act faithfully despite fear. Courage isn't the absence of terror, but obedience in its presence. Joshua would face fortified cities, coalition armies, tactical challenges that could easily overwhelm. His strength wouldn't come from self-confidence, but from trusting the one who'd called him. The commission included specific promises. "I will be with you," echoed the assurance given to Moses at the burning bush. Joshua wouldn't lead alone. Divine presence would accompany him just as it had accompanied his predecessor. This continuity mattered. The mission continued. The Almighty's purposes persisted across generational change. But the commissioning also carried implicit challenge. Joshua had spent 40 years watching Moses, learning through observation, seeing both triumphs and failures. Now came his turn. Would he prove faithful where Moses had stumbled? Would he avoid the pride that caused Moses to strike instead of speak? Would he maintain humility while wielding authority? The tent of meeting held memory. This was where Moses had spoken with the divine presence face to face, where the cloud descended, where Joshua himself had stood guard during Moses' mountain ascent. Now this same space witnessed Joshua's formal elevation. The location linked past to future, reminded everyone that the mission transcended individuals. Moses finished the commissioning by writing the law in a book and commanding the Levites to place it beside the Ark of the Covenant. "Take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you." Even Moses' greatest work, the law itself, would become testimony against the people if they proved unfaithful. This too instructed Joshua. Success meant more than military conquest. It required maintaining covenant faithfulness, ensuring the people obeyed the commands they'd received. Victory in battle mattered less than victory over idolatry, compromise, corruption. The true battle was always spiritual. The ceremony concluded. Joshua stood before the people no longer as Moses' assistant, but as Moses' successor. The hand had been laid, the words spoken, the authority transferred. Soon Moses would ascend Mount Nebo, gaze across Jordan at the land he'd never enter, and expire according to divine timing. But Joshua would remain. Joshua would cross, Joshua would lead, not because he'd sought the role, not because he felt adequate, but because the Almighty had called him and commissioned him and promised to be with him. The mantle had passed, the apprenticeship had ended, now came the work. Crossing the Rubicon, the Jordan River stands still. The Jordan River swelled beyond its banks, a churning barrier between wilderness and promise. Joshua stood at the edge with an entire nation camped behind him, several 100,000 people looking to him for direction, waiting for the commander to do something impossible. The river raged at flood stage, fed by spring rains and snowmelt from the northern mountains. Crossing wasn't simply difficult, it was suicidal. This was Joshua's first test as Moses' successor. The people had mourned the prophet for 30 days. They'd seen him ascend Nebo and disappear into divine presence. Now they faced the reality of new leadership, and that leadership confronted an obstacle that made military strategy irrelevant. You can't outflank geography. But Joshua had learned at Kadesh Barnea to interpret impossibility through promise rather than probability. 40 years earlier, the spies had seen fortifications and giants and declared conquest impossible. Joshua had stood with Caleb and declared it possible because the Almighty had promised. Now, looking at the swollen Jordan, he applied the same logic. The command came, prepare to cross. In 3 days, the people would pass over the Jordan into the land the Almighty was giving them. No explanation of method, no engineering solution, just the declaration that crossing would happen because divine purposes demanded it. Joshua issued specific instructions. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant would lead. They would step into the Jordan's waters while the river still raged. The entire nation would follow, maintaining distance behind the ark about 2,000 cubits, roughly 1,000 yards, so everyone could see the sacred object leading them. The arrangement mattered. The ark represented divine presence dwelling among them. It led not because priests were expendable, but because the Almighty Himself would go first, cutting the path. Human leadership followed divine initiative. Joshua commanded, but the ark led. The order of march made theology visible. On the appointed day, the priests lifted the ark and approached the riverbank. The people broke camp, forming into tribal units, preparing to move. Everything depended on what happened next. If the priests stepped in and drowned, if the river swept them away, Joshua's authority would drown with them. The entire nation would witness his first major command producing catastrophe. The priests reached the Jordan's edge. They stepped into the water, feet meeting the muddy current, and the river stopped. Upstream at Adam, a city near Zarethan, the waters heaped up, rising in a standing wall. Downstream toward the Salt Sea, the flow cut off completely. The riverbed between opened, revealing mud and stone. The barrier that had seemed impassable simply ceased. The priests carrying the ark moved forward, walking out to the river's center. There they stood, planted on dry ground, holding position while the entire nation crossed. Tribe after tribe passed the priests, walked through the Jordan's bed, emerged on Canaan's western bank. The impossible crossing became mundane reality. Families with children, livestock, wagons, all processing through what had been raging water moments before. Think about the priests' experience. Standing in the river's midst, feeling the ground solid beneath their feet, watching thousands upon thousands file past. The miracle depended on their sustained obedience, staying in position, maintaining their burden, trusting that the waters wouldn't suddenly release and sweep them away. They couldn't abandon post or seek safety. They were the anchors holding space for an entire people's transition. Joshua orchestrated more than a crossing. He created a testimony. Before the people entered the Jordan, he'd selected 12 men, one from each tribe, and given them specific instructions. As they crossed, each would take a stone from the riverbed, from the exact spot where the priest stood. These 12 stones would become memorial, proof that the crossing had happened, evidence for future generations. The people crossed. The stones were taken. Then Joshua commanded something additional. He set up 12 stones in the Jordan itself at the place where the priests stood. These would remain submerged after the waters returned. Invisible testimony beneath the surface, known only to those who'd witnessed the miracle. When the last person reached the western bank, when the entire nation stood in Canaan, Joshua gave the final command. The priests carrying the ark came up from the Jordan. As soon as their feet touched dry land, as soon as the ark left the riverbed, the waters returned. The Jordan resumed its flood stage surge as though nothing had interrupted its flow. The timing couldn't be coincidental. The water stopped when priests carrying divine presence stepped in. It returned when they stepped out. The miracle responded to their movement, to the ark's position. Geography submitted to holiness. Nature yielded to covenant purposes. The impossible bowed before the Almighty's will made tangible in wood and gold. Joshua erected the 12 stones at Gilgal, their first camp in Canaan. He addressed the people, "When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, here we crossed over the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty." Notice the parallel Joshua drew. The Jordan crossing echoed the Red Sea miracle that began their journey. Moses had led them through water at the Exodus's start. Joshua led them through water at conquest's beginning. The pattern repeated, connecting one generation's deliverance to the next generation's inheritance. But Joshua understood something else the crossing accomplished. The Canaanite peoples heard what happened. The text records their reaction. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites, who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people until they had crossed over, Their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people. The miracle was warfare. Before Joshua fought a single battle, he defeated the enemy's will to resist. They'd heard about the Red Sea, ancient history, 40 years past, easily dismissed. But this happened now, visible and undeniable. Any people who could command rivers to stand still couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. The Canaanites' psychological defeat preceded their military collapse. Joshua stood on Canaan's soil, the Jordan flowing behind him. An entire nation camped around him. Moses had led them out through water. Joshua had led them in through water. The parallel was complete. The succession was confirmed. But this was just the beginning. Ahead lay fortified cities, coalition armies, peoples who wouldn't surrender without blood. The Jordan crossing proved divine presence accompanied Joshua. Now came the test of whether he could translate that presence into conquest, promise into possession, miracle into territory. The stones at Gilgal stood as witness. Your children will ask what they mean, Joshua had said. When they ask, tell them, here the impossible yielded to faithfulness, here geography bowed to covenant, here we learned again that barriers exist only until the Almighty decides otherwise. The Jordan had been crossed. The invasion had begun. Stones of remembrance, building a memorial at Gilgal, memory requires architecture. Without structure, experience dissolves into vague recollection, then fades entirely. Joshua understood this truth with crystalline clarity. The Jordan crossing had just demonstrated divine power in undeniable fashion. A swollen river stopping in response to priestly obedience, an entire nation walking through on dry ground. Miraculous, unmistakable, impossible to dismiss as natural phenomenon or lucky timing. But Joshua knew something about human nature that the miracle itself couldn't address. People forget. Not immediately, not within weeks or even years. But eventually, inevitably, memory erodes. What seems unforgettable becomes uncertain, then questionable, then mythical. Future generations would hear the story and wonder if it really happened, if perhaps the tale had grown in the telling. So Joshua built testimony into the landscape itself. Before the crossing, he'd selected 12 men, one from each tribe. Their assignment was specific. When the priests carrying the ark stood in the Jordan's midst, when the entire nation passed through, these 12 would take stones from the riverbed. Not small pebbles, but substantial rocks, the kind requiring strength to lift and carry. Stones that would last, that wouldn't weather away in a season or decade. The men obeyed. As they crossed, each selected his stone from the exact spot where the priests maintained position. 12 stones, 12 tribes, one unified testimony. They carried these from the Jordan's bed to the western bank, bearing physical evidence of the miracle in their arms. Joshua directed them to Gilgal, the place where the people made their first camp in Canaan. There, under his supervision, they erected the stones into a memorial. The text doesn't specify exact configuration, perhaps arranged in a circle, perhaps stacked as a cairn, perhaps simply positioned in deliberate formation. The arrangement mattered less than the permanence. But Joshua didn't stop with construction. He provided interpretation, gave the stones meaning beyond their material presence. He addressed the people directly. When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, here we crossed over the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over. Notice the pedagogical strategy. Joshua anticipated the question children would ask. Visible, unexplained monuments provoke curiosity. Children see stones arranged deliberately and wonder why. The strangeness itself becomes teaching opportunity. The stones create questions that require parents to tell the story. This is memory as inheritance. The generation that crossed wouldn't need stones to remember. They'd experienced the miracle firsthand. But their children, born in Canaan, would have no personal memory of the event, and their children's children even less. Within 3 generations, living witnesses would be gone. The stones would remain, demanding explanation, forcing each new generation to reckon with their ancestors' testimony. Joshua drew an explicit parallel. Just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over. He connected Jordan to Exodus, Moses to Joshua, one generation's deliverance to the next generation's inheritance. The pattern mattered. The Almighty works consistently across time, his character unchanging even as circumstances shift. But the memorial served additional purpose beyond teaching descendants. Joshua articulated it clearly, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. The stones testified not just to the people, but to surrounding nations. Canaanites would see the memorial and understand the nature of the enemy facing them. You couldn't fight stones. You couldn't argue with testimony built into landscape. The location of Gilgal itself carried significance. This became their base of operations during conquest, the place they returned to between campaigns. Every time they came back, they encountered the stones. The memorial functioned as constant reminder during the grinding work of warfare. Yes, this task is difficult. Yes, conquest requires blood and effort, but remember, the same power that stopped the Jordan fights beside you. Joshua also set up stones within the Jordan itself, at the exact spot where the priests had stood. These remained submerged once waters returned, invisible to future generations but known to those present. Why create hidden testimony? Perhaps because some truths don't require public visibility to be real. The underwater stones testified that the miracle happened in actual space, at specific coordinates. They marked sacred ground beneath ordinary river, anchoring memory to geography, even when that geography became inaccessible. Faith doesn't depend on seeing everything. Sometimes knowing something exists beneath the surface is enough. The memorial at Gilgal represented Joshua's understanding that spiritual leadership requires more than accomplishing immediate objectives. You must build infrastructure of remembrance, create mechanisms that transmit faith across generational boundaries. Stones outlast stories. Physical monuments provide handles for memory to grip when oral tradition grows slippery. Think about the long-term impact. Centuries later, those stones still stood at Gilgal. Prophets could reference them. Teachers could point to them. Skeptics couldn't dismiss them as mere legend, because there they were, arranged deliberately, demanding explanation. The memorial became argument, either accept that the crossing happened as described, or propose some alternative theory for why someone built a monument commemorating it. Joshua's strategy worked. The stones appear repeatedly in later narratives, referenced as evidence, used to teach subsequent generations. The memorial accomplished exactly what Joshua designed it to accomplish. It kept memory alive when living witnesses died. It provoked questions that required theological answers. It testified to divine power across centuries. But the memorial also carried warning. If stones could testify to faithfulness, they could equally witness unfaithfulness. The same monument that said, "Here the Almighty demonstrated power," also implied, "Therefore you are obligated to obedience." The stones at Gilgal would stand as accusation if future generations abandoned covenant commitments. Testimony cuts both ways. Joshua created more than monument. He built curriculum, designed intergenerational teaching tool, constructed testimony that would outlast everyone present at its construction. The stones asked questions. The story provided answers. And as long as stones endured, memory would too. The Jordan crossing was complete. The people had arrived in Canaan, but Joshua ensured that arrival wouldn't be forgotten, that the miracle would echo through time, that children not yet born would inherit not just land, but the knowledge of how that land was gained. Memory requires architecture. Joshua built well. The commander's sword, the theophany before Jericho. Joshua walked alone near Jericho, studying the city's defenses with the commander's eye. Massive walls rose before him, fortifications that had repelled armies for generations. The city sat atop its tell, layer upon layer of human habitation compressed into a defensible mound. Gates of bronze and timber, watchmen patrolling the ramparts. A fortress that seemed to mock any notion of assault. He'd been circling the city, observing, calculating, attempting to formulate strategy. How do you breach walls that thick with an army of former slaves and their children? What tactics could possibly work against stone and bronze when your people's primary experience involves wandering and herding sheep? Then Joshua saw him, a man standing ahead with drawn sword in hand. The figure's presence there made no sense. This close to Jericho, in territory the city controlled, any man should be identified. Israelite or Canaanite, ally or enemy. But this one simply stood, sword ready, watching Joshua approach. Joshua did what military commanders do when encountering armed unknowns. He challenged, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" The question demanded clarity. Friend or foe? Simple binary. State your allegiance. The answer shattered Joshua's categories. No. Not "I'm with you," not "I oppose you." Just no, a refusal to accept the framework of the question itself. Then the figure continued, "But I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." The words carried implications that must have staggered Joshua. Commander of the Lord's army? That was supposed to be Joshua's role. He'd been commissioned, appointed, given authority to lead the people in conquest. Yet here stood someone claiming superior rank, identifying himself as leader of forces Joshua thought he commanded. Joshua's response revealed his spiritual wisdom. He didn't argue about authority or defend his position. He fell on his face to the ground and worshipped. Then he asked, "What does my Lord say to it?" The posture said everything. Joshua recognized he'd encountered something beyond human, something that demanded submission rather than negotiation. The question, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" repositioned Joshua from commander to subordinate, from leader to follower. The figure gave a simple command, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." The instruction echoed the burning bush when Moses encountered divine presence and received identical command. Remove your sandals, acknowledge holy ground, recognize you stand before something that makes location itself sacred through presence alone. Joshua obeyed. The text offers no additional details about the conversation. We aren't told what specific instructions the commander of the Lord's army gave, what tactical advice he provided, what strategy he recommended. The narrative moves directly from Joshua's obedience to the siege of Jericho itself. This silence carries meaning. The encounter wasn't primarily about receiving information, but about reorienting understanding. Joshua had been thinking of himself as supreme commander, responsible for developing strategy, for determining how to breach Jericho's defenses. The theophany corrected this misunderstanding. Joshua wasn't the commander. He was a subordinate officer taking orders. The true commander of the Lord's army had appeared to make this clear. Joshua's role was to obey, not to create, to execute orders, not to design campaign strategy from scratch. The invasion of Canaan wasn't Joshua's operation. It was a divine campaign in which Joshua had the privilege of participating. The figure's identity has sparked theological debate across centuries. Was this an angel? The pre-incarnate Christ? A manifestation of divine presence? The text doesn't clarify, but certain details suggest this was more than mere angelic messenger. Joshua worshipped, and the figure accepted worship, something angels typically refuse. The ground became holy through his presence. He identified himself as commander of the Lord's army, speaking with authority that brooked no challenge. Whatever his precise identity, his effect was unmistakable. He repositioned Joshua from protagonist to supporting character in a larger narrative. The conquest wasn't about Joshua's tactical brilliance or military genius. It was about divine power working through willing human instrumentality. Consider the timing. This encounter happened before Jericho's siege, at the moment when Joshua most needed strategic clarity. Facing his first major city assault, responsible for leading an inexperienced army against formidable fortifications, Joshua needed to know, am I alone in this, or does power beyond my own fight beside me? The commander's appearance answered that question decisively. You're not alone. You're not even primarily responsible. The army you think you command actually belongs to someone else. Your task is to follow orders, trust the strategy given, obey even when instructions seem absurd. This prepared Joshua for what came next, the bizarre tactics for taking Jericho. March around the city silently for 6 days. On the 7th, circle it 7 times, then shout. No siege engines, no assault ladders, no conventional military approach, just walking and shouting. Absurd. Militarily nonsensical. But if you've just encountered the commander of the Lord's army, if you've been reminded that this campaign belongs to him, if you've repositioned yourself as servant rather than master, then bizarre tactics become opportunities for obedience rather than occasions for doubt. The encounter at Jericho mirrored deeper truth about Joshua's entire mission. He'd been commissioned by Moses, appointed before the congregation, given authority to lead. All true. but ultimate authority remained elsewhere. Joshua commanded only by delegation, led only because higher leadership worked through him, succeeded only because divine power channeled through his obedience. The drawn sword in the commander's hand suggested readiness for battle. But whose battle? Not Joshua's, the Lord's. Joshua joined a campaign already in progress, supported by armies he couldn't see, directed by strategy he couldn't fully comprehend, guaranteed victory not through his skill, but through whose side he fought on. Joshua rose from the holy ground with his sandals in his hand and walked toward Jericho. The walls still loomed. The defenses remained formidable. Nothing about the military situation had changed. But everything about Joshua's understanding had been transformed. He wasn't fighting alone. He wasn't fighting primarily at all. He was following the commander of an army that included forces beyond his perception, participating in a victory already secured in realms beyond his sight. His task was simply to obey the orders that would make that invisible victory visible in time and space. The commander had drawn his sword. Soon Jericho's walls would learn why. The walls came down, the siege and miracle of Jericho. 7 priests walked before the ark, each carrying a ram's horn, blowing steady notes that echoed off Jericho's walls. Behind them came the Ark of the Covenant, carried by its priestly bearers. Behind the ark marched the armed guard, and behind them walked the entire nation in formation, silent except for the blast of the shofars. They circled Jericho once, completing the circuit, then returned to camp at Gilgal without speaking a word. The strategy made no tactical sense. Besieging armies build ramps, construct battering rams, dig tunnels, or simply wait for starvation to break the defender's will. They don't march around walls blowing horns and then leave. Yet this was Joshua's command, received from higher authority. Circle the city once daily for 6 days, maintaining absolute silence except for the priests' trumpet blasts. Inside Jericho, the defenders watched this bizarre ritual with growing unease. They'd already heard reports. The Jordan stopping, the massive invasion force crossing into Canaan. Now the enemy marched around their walls daily, employing no visible siege strategy, just walking and blowing horns. The psychological effect must have been excruciating. What were the Israelites doing? What would happen next? Joshua had ordered strict discipline. You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout. The silence served multiple purposes. It enforced obedience. Every person had to control themselves, coordinate with the group. It built anticipation. It created eerie atmosphere that amplified the shofar blasts, and it demonstrated that this operation followed script, not improvisation. Day 2. The same procedure. Circle once, horns blowing, complete silence otherwise, return to camp. No escalation, no variation, just repetition. Day 3. Again. The routine became ritual. The military operation transformed into ceremony. But ceremony with purpose, each circuit reinforcing the lesson. Victory here wouldn't come through conventional means. Day 4, 5, 6, each day identical. The defenders atop Jericho's walls grew familiar with the pattern. Perhaps they began to relax, to dismiss the Israelites as engaging in meaningless religious exercise. Perhaps they laughed. Perhaps they felt their walls more secure with each day that passed without actual assault. Then came day 7. This day broke the pattern. The procession formed as usual. Armed guard, priests with trumpets, ark, rear guard, the people. But instead of circling once and departing, they circled twice, then 3 times. The repetition continued without explanation. 4, 5, 6, 7 times they circled Jericho, the priests' horns blowing continuously. On the 7th circuit, as they completed the 7th lap around the city, Joshua gave the command, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The silence shattered. Several 100,000 voices erupted simultaneously in coordinated shout, a sound that must have been physically stunning in its volume and intensity. And at that moment, Jericho's walls collapsed. The text offers no naturalistic explanation, not undermined by tunneling or weakened by earthquake, or breached by rams. Just the walls fell down flat. Massive fortifications, stone that had stood for generations. Defenses that should have withstood any assault, they simply fell. The impossible happened because the commander of the Lord's army had ordered it, and Joshua had obeyed the absurd strategy given. The collapse opened Jericho to total assault. Joshua's command was explicit and terrible. Devote the city to destruction. All living things, men, women, children, livestock, everything must be devoted. This was harem, the covenant practice of total dedication to the divine. Nothing could be taken for personal use. No plunder, no spoils, no slaves. Everything belonged to the Almighty, and that which belonged to him would be consumed. The Israelites poured into Jericho through the fallen walls. The battle was swift and complete. The population faced total destruction, with only one exception: Rahab the prostitute and her household, who'd hidden the Israelite spies during reconnaissance and extracted an oath of protection. Her family alone survived, marked by scarlet cord hung from her window. Joshua reinforced the harem with solemn oath: "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." Jericho would remain testimony to divine power, its ruins a permanent reminder. Rebuilding it would invoke covenant curse. The gold, silver, bronze, and iron were collected and brought into the Lord's treasury. These alone escaped destruction, dedicated to holy purposes, but everything else burned. The city that had seemed impregnable became ash and rubble within hours. Think about what this accomplished strategically. Jericho was Canaan's gateway city, controlling the approaches from the east. Its fall opened access to the central hill country, splitting the northern and southern territories. But more important than tactical advantage was the message the victory sent. News spread through Canaan, an entire city destroyed without siege engines or prolonged assault. Walls that had stood for ages collapsed at a shout. No negotiation, no terms, no quarter, just total dedication to destruction. Every other fortified city suddenly seemed vulnerable. If Jericho could fall that way, what hope did anyone have of resistance? Joshua had learned the lesson from his encounter with the commander of the Lord's army. This victory belonged to powers beyond human capability. The absurd tactics, marching and shouting, ensured that no one could credit human skill or conventional warfare. The walls fell not because the Israelites were militarily superior, but because divine power fought for them. The memorial of stones at Gilgal testified to the Jordan crossing. Jericho's ruins became permanent testimony to conquest. Together, they formed witnesses that future generations couldn't ignore. Here the Almighty stopped a river. Here he toppled walls. Here he demonstrated that geography and architecture submit to his purposes. But Jericho also established the rules of engagement for conquest. The harem wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was covenant enforcement. These lands had been given to the Almighty's people, and the giving required total purging of previous inhabitants and their practices. Partial conquest would lead to compromise. Compromise would lead to adoption of Canaanite ways. Adoption would lead to covenant betrayal. The severity was preventative. Joshua executed the divine strategy, however harsh it seemed, because the alternative, partial obedience, mercy, that became compromise, would ultimately doom the entire mission. Jericho fell on the seventh day of the Seventh Circuit after 7 days of preparation. The pattern of 7 emphasized completion, perfection, divine orchestration. Nothing about this victory was accidental. Everything followed script given by the commander of the Lord's army. The ruins smoldered, the treasury held Jericho's metals. Rahab lived among the people as testimony to the power of faith, even among Canaanites. And the Israelites returned to Gilgal, their base camp, having secured their first major victory in Canaan. The walls had come down. The conquest had truly begun. The stain in the camp. Sin, defeat, and Achan's rebellion victory at Jericho echoed through the camp like a shofar blast. The walls fell. The city burned. Everything seemed unstoppable. Then came Ai. 3,000 men marched toward the small fortress. They expected swift victory. Instead, 36 bodies came home. The survivors fled back to camp with terror in their hearts. What had seemed like an easy conquest became a rout. Joshua tore his clothes. He fell face down before the ark. The elders joined him, throwing dust on their heads in grief. Defeat was more than military failure. It meant something had fractured between them and the divine presence that parted the Jordan. Joshua's lament rose bitter. "Why did you bring us across this river just to hand us over to destruction? We should have stayed beyond the Jordan." His words carried the weight of a leader watching everything unravel. The divine response came sharp. "Stand up. Why are you lying face down? The nation has broken covenant. Someone took what belonged to me from Jericho's ruins, stolen goods, hidden treasures, lies layered upon theft. The morning brought a solemn assembly. Tribe by tribe, clan by clan, family by family, the lots fell. The process moved like a narrowing noose. First Judah, then the Zerahites, then the household of Zabdi. Finally, a single name emerged: Achan, son of Carmi. Joshua addressed him gently despite everything. My son, give glory to the Lord. Tell me what you have done. Do not hide it. The confession spilled out. I have acted against the Lord. When I saw a beautiful robe from Babylon among the plunder, I wanted it. 200 shekels of silver gleamed in the rubble. A bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. I coveted them. I took them. I buried them beneath my tent with the silver deepest down. Messengers ran to his dwelling. They found everything exactly as described, the forbidden treasures hidden in the earth like a shameful secret. They brought the items before the entire assembly, spreading them on the ground in plain view. The sight confirmed what everyone feared. One person's desire had brought disaster on thousands. The hidden things from Jericho, devoted entirely to destruction or to the Lord's treasury, had been claimed for personal gain. The covenant stipulated absolute obedience. Jericho was the first fruits of conquest, belonging wholly to the divine claim on Canaan. Joshua and the people took Achan to the valley of Achor. His silver went with him, his gold, his robe, his sons and daughters, his oxen and donkeys, his tent and everything he possessed. The community understood corporate responsibility. One person's transgression had threatened everyone. The hidden sin needed exposure. The covenant needed restoration. Stones fell. Fire can heap mark the spot. The place received its name that day, Valley of Achor, Valley of Trouble. It stood as testimony that concealed rebellion brings catastrophe. What seemed like a private decision, taking a few items from ruins no one would miss, had rippled outward into communal disaster. The biblical text makes clear that before Ai's defeat, the people acted unfaithfully regarding the devoted things. Though only one man reached into the ash and plunder, the entire nation bore the consequence. 36 warriors who knew nothing of Achan's hidden cache paid with their lives on Ai's slopes. The pattern revealed itself with terrible clarity. Achan saw, he coveted, he took, he hid. Each step led to the next, a progression from desire through action to concealment. The eye became the entry point for sin. The heart nurtured the wanting. The hand executed the theft. The earth became an accomplice in hiding evidence. What stands out is not just the severity of the judgment, but its purpose. The community needed purification before moving forward. The Lord's anger burned, not merely against one person, but against the entire people until the devoted things were removed. The covenant relationship required holiness. Compromise in this regard meant vulnerability before enemies. Joshua's response showed leadership under crisis. He didn't minimize the situation or make excuses. He didn't hide what happened. Instead, he led the community through the painful process of identifying and removing the source of defilement. The lots weren't random. They revealed what needed revealing. The story carries weight beyond its immediate context. It shows that private sins have public consequences. It demonstrates that what we hide still affects those around us. It reveals that covenant community means shared responsibility. When one member compromises, everyone suffers. The Valley of Achor became a landmark. Generations later, prophets would reference it. The heap of stones remained. The name endured. It served as perpetual reminder that faithfulness matters, that obedience carries weight, that hidden things eventually surface. After Achan's judgment, the text makes a simple statement. Then the Lord turned from his burning anger. The blockage was removed. The relationship was restored. The path forward opened again. What had been closed through disobedience became accessible through cleansing. This wasn't merely about punishment, it was about restoration. The community couldn't move forward carrying unaddressed rebellion. The conquest required holiness. The presence required purity. The promise required obedience. Achan's removal wasn't vindictive. It was surgical, necessary for the body's health. The 36 who fell at Ai didn't die for their own sins. They died because corporate unfaithfulness made the community vulnerable. Their losses underscored a crucial reality. We're connected. Our choices ripple outward. Our compromises affect others. Our hidden actions have visible consequences. The ambush at Ai, tactical brilliance, and total victory morning came with new instructions. Do not fear. Take all your fighting men and rise against Ai. I have given you the king, his people, his city, and his land. This time, different parameters applied. You may keep the plunder and livestock for yourselves. Where Jericho demanded total devotion to destruction, Ai's wealth could be claimed. What Achan reached for in disobedience would now come through obedience. One more directive followed. Set an ambush behind the city. Joshua selected 30,000 warriors. Under darkness, they moved into position west of Ai, settling between Bethel and the target city. Their instructions were precise. Hide close to the city, stay ready, wait for the signal. Joshua took the main force northward at dawn, marching them openly across the valley until they stood in full view of Ai's defenders. The people in the city could count every fighter. The positioning seemed straightforward, a frontal assault just like the failed attempt before. A second ambush unit, 5,000 strong, took position between Bethel and Ai. Their purpose was defensive, to prevent Bethel's forces from reinforcing their allies. Every contingency was covered. Every angle was protected. The king of Ai watched the Israelite army approaching from the north. Memory of the previous victory must have filled him with confidence. They'd routed these invaders before. They could do it again. He gathered his warriors and rushed out to meet the threat, never suspecting what waited behind his city walls. Joshua and his troops staged a retreat the moment Ai's forces engaged. The flight looked genuine: panic, disorder, men running toward the wilderness. Ai's defenders chased them eagerly, drawing farther from their city with every step. Every warrior left his post. The city stood empty, gates open, defenses abandoned. The pursuers shouted to each other, "They're fleeing, just like before! We have them!" Then Joshua raised his javelin toward Ai. The signal released the ambush. 30,000 warriors rose from their concealed positions and poured into the undefended city. They moved quickly, torching buildings until flames and smoke billowed into the sky. Ai's fighters looked back. Smoke rose where their city had stood. Black columns climbed toward heaven. Suddenly they realized, trapped between two forces with no city to retreat to, the wilderness-fleeing army ahead turned to face them. The ambush force emerged from the burning city behind them. The pincer closed. Israelite warriors struck from both sides. Ai's defenders found themselves caught in a vice with no escape route. Those who tried to flee met swords. Those who tried to fight were overwhelmed. The battle became a slaughter. By day's end, 12,000 lay dead, every person from Ai. Only the king survived, taken captive and brought to Joshua. The text notes specifically, not a man remained or escaped. Joshua hanged the king on a tree until evening. At sunset, his body was cut down and thrown at the city gate entrance, covered with a great heap of rocks. Another memorial, another witness to what happens when kingdoms stand against the Lord's purposes. The tactical brilliance of this operation stands out. Joshua used deception masterfully, making Ai's king believe he was facing the same situation as before. The feigned retreat exploited the enemy's overconfidence. The coordinated timing between ambush forces required precise communication. The blocking position prevented reinforcements. Every element worked together seamlessly. This was conventional warfare guided by divine instruction. Where Jericho fell through miraculous intervention, Ai fell through military strategy. Both victories came from following the Lord's direction, but the methods differed entirely. Joshua adapted his approach to match what the situation required. The contrast with the first assault couldn't be sharper. Before, presumption, failure to inquire, partial deployment, defeat. After, obedience, full commitment, strategic planning, victory. The lesson was clear. Success depended not on past achievements, but on present faithfulness. Ai's destruction accomplished several things. It secured a foothold in the Central Highlands. It restored the nation's confidence after the demoralizing loss. It demonstrated that the initial defeat wasn't divine abandonment, but temporary withdrawal due to covenant violation. Once the sin was addressed, the power returned. The victory also validated Joshua's leadership. The first defeat had raised questions. Leaders sometimes face scrutiny when things go wrong. But Joshua's handling of the crisis, identifying the problem, addressing it decisively, then leading the people back into battle, proved his capability. He neither panicked nor gave up. He worked through the challenge methodically. After the battle, Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal, exactly as Moses had commanded. He used uncut stones following the specifications precisely. Burnt offerings and fellowship offerings went up in smoke. Then Joshua copied the law of Moses onto stones while the entire assembly watched. Men, women, children, resident foreigners, all of them. The nation divided itself between two mountains. Half stood before Mount Gerizim, half before Mount Ebal. The Levitical priests holding the ark stood in the middle. Then Joshua read aloud every word of the law, blessings and curses, commands and warnings, promises and conditions. Nothing was left out. Everyone heard, everyone understood. This ceremony reinforced what Ai had taught. Obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings curse. The physical geography reinforced the spiritual reality. Two mountains, two possibilities, one choice. The recent contrast between Jericho's triumph and Ai's initial defeat had demonstrated these truths in blood. The heap of ruins where Ai once stood became another permanent witness. Like the 12 stones from Jordan, like the heap over Achan, like the memorial at the city gate, these physical markers kept the lessons visible. Future generations would ask about them. The stories would be told again. The patterns would be remembered. From Gilgal to Ai, the distance was about 15 miles. Joshua's troops had marched that route repeatedly, first in defeat, then in victory. The same ground witnessed both outcomes. The difference wasn't terrain or enemy strength. The difference was covenant faithfulness and divine presence. The plunder from Ai went into Israelite hands, livestock, goods, everything of value. What Achan grasped illegally from Jericho, the people received legitimately from Ai. Patient obedience yielded what impatient disobedience could never secure. The timing mattered. The process mattered. The submission to divine order mattered. Ai's conquest also sent messages beyond its immediate impact. Other kingdoms watched. Other rulers took note. The narrative was spreading. This nation fights with supernatural backing. Their God intervenes. Their victories are decisive. Opposition means destruction. The Gibeonite deception. A covenant of cunning news traveled fast through Canaan. Jericho's walls collapsed. Ai burned to ash. Kings in the hill country, in the lowlands, along the Mediterranean coast, all the way to Lebanon. They heard the reports and took action. An alliance formed. Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, 6 regional powers joining forces to confront the invading threat. Military coalitions made strategic sense when facing a common enemy. But Gibeon chose a different path. The Gibeonites were Hivites, technically part of the anti-Israelite alliance, but instead of joining the military coalition, they launched a campaign of cunning. They'd heard the same reports as everyone else, not just about recent victories, but about older events. They knew what happened in Egypt. They knew about Sihon and Og east of the Jordan. They understood the pattern. This nation doesn't just defeat enemies, it obliterates them. So they assembled a delegation. But first, they carefully constructed an illusion. Worn-out sacks went onto their donkeys' backs. Cracked wineskins, split and patched, hung from the saddles. They put on weathered sandals, threadbare from long miles. Their clothes showed road dust and repair work. The bread they carried was dry, crumbling, covered with spots of mold. Everything about them screamed, distant travelers. They arrived at Gilgal and presented themselves to Joshua. "We have come from a far country. We wish to make a treaty with you." The Israelite leaders looked them over skeptically. "Perhaps you live near us? How can we make a treaty with you if you're from this region?" The Gibeonites had prepared their response carefully. "We are your servants. We've heard of your God's reputation, everything he did in Egypt, everything he accomplished against the 2 kings beyond the Jordan, Sihon of Heshbon and Og of Bashan. Our elders sent us to meet you and offer to become your servants. Please, make a treaty with us." They gestured to their provisions. "Look at our bread. It was warm from the oven when we packed it for this journey. Now it's dry and moldy. These wineskins were new when we filled them. Now they're cracked. Our clothes and sandals are worn out from the very long journey." The Israelites examined the provisions. They looked at the moldy bread, felt the dried-out texture, inspected the cracked wineskins. Everything confirmed the story. These travelers had clearly come a great distance. Then they made their critical mistake. They did not inquire of the Lord. Joshua made peace with the Gibeonites. The leaders of the assembly swore an oath to let them live. Treaties were sacred. Oaths carried binding weight. Once spoken before the Lord, words couldn't be revoked. 3 days later, the truth surfaced. The Israelites learned that these distant travelers actually lived nearby. Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, Kiriath Jearim, all of them within the territory marked for conquest. The entire delegation had been a theatrical performance. The people grumbled against their leaders. They'd been trapped by deception into a covenant they should never have made. Divine command was clear. No treaties with nearby peoples, no alliances with Canaan's inhabitants. Yet here they stood, oath-bound to protect Hivite cities. The leaders defended their decision, even though they'd been deceived. We swore to them by the Lord, the God of the realm, we cannot touch them now. If we break our oath, divine anger will fall on us. Joshua summoned the Gibeonites. Why did you deceive us? You claim to come from far away when you live right among us. Because of this, you are cursed. You will forever be servants, woodcutters, and water carriers for the house of the Lord. The Gibeonites' response revealed their motivation. We were clearly told that your God commanded Moses to give you all this land and destroy all its inhabitants. We feared for our lives because of you. That's why we did this thing. Now we're in your hands. Do whatever seems right. Fear of the Lord, ironically, had driven their deception. They believed so strongly in the divine promise that they resorted to trickery to survive its fulfillment. Better to serve under permanent curse than face annihilation. Joshua protected them from the angry assembly. He assigned them to menial labor, cutting wood, drawing water, serving the community and the altar wherever the Lord chose to establish it. They accepted this arrangement. Their deception had purchased survival. The price was perpetual servitude. But they lived. This situation created lasting consequences. The Gibeonite cities became part of the larger community, protected by treaty even though the treaty came through fraud. Later events would demonstrate the binding nature of this oath. Centuries afterward, when King Saul attempted to eliminate the Gibeonites in misguided zeal, famine struck the land until restitution was made. The oath held that much weight. Several failures converged in this episode. The Israelites relied on visible evidence, moldy bread, worn sandals, cracked wineskins, without seeking divine guidance. They trusted their assessment. They believed their eyes. But sight can mislead. Appearances can be manufactured. The text specifically notes, they did not inquire of the Lord. This phrase echoes the earlier mistake at Ai when scouts advised attacking with minimal force. Both times, human judgment replaced divine consultation. Both times, complications resulted. Yet the story also reveals something profound about divine purposes. The Gibeonites feared correctly. They recognized the Lord's power and promises. Their faith, though expressed through deception, secured their inclusion in the covenant community. Like Rahab before them, Gentiles found refuge through acknowledging the true God, even if their methods were flawed. The permanent servitude assigned to Gibeon wasn't merely punitive. It brought them into regular contact with Israel's worship life. As woodcutters and water carriers for the altar, they served at the heart of the religious system. Their curse became an unexpected path to blessing, proximity to the divine presence, participation in the covenant community, protection under the Lord's name. The diplomatic trap also served strategic purposes. Gibeon was a significant city, larger than Ai, with an experienced fighting force. Having them as allies rather than enemies positioned Israel favorably in the Central Highlands. The deception that seemed like a failure became, through divine providence, a tactical advantage. The Gibeonite Treaty illustrated a recurring biblical theme. Human mistakes don't thwart divine plans. The Lord works through flawed decisions, turning apparent setbacks into unexpected benefits. The same pattern appeared with Rahab. A prostitute who hid spies became an ancestor of kings. Now servants obtained through deception would serve the altar. Joining the community they'd feared would destroy them. This episode marked a subtle shift in the conquest narrative. Where Jericho and Ai involved military action and miraculous intervention, the Gibeonite situation introduced diplomacy, albeit fraudulent diplomacy. The challenge wasn't always armed resistance. Sometimes it came through more subtle means, agreements, alliances, treaties that compromised the mission through seemingly peaceful channels. The heap of moldy bread that convinced Israel's leaders became another kind of memorial. Not a physical monument like the stone piles at Jordan and Achor, but a remembered lesson, Appearances deceive, wisdom requires more than observation, critical decisions demand divine consultation. What seems obvious might be theater, what looks genuine might be costume. Moving forward, Joshua would face more complex situations requiring discernment beyond military strategy. The conquest was proving multifaceted. Battles, yes, but also treaties, alliances, political maneuvering. Each scenario demanded fresh dependence on divine guidance rather than reliance on past successes or present appearances. The Gibeonites entered the story through fear and cunning. They remained through oath and service. Their presence would soon trigger the next major military campaign, demonstrating that even mistakes within the divine purpose move the narrative toward its intended destination. The day the sun stood still, the battle of the five kings. Word reached Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem. The news struck with particular force. Gibeon had made peace with Joshua. Gibeon, a major city, larger than Ai, with warrior citizens, had surrendered without a fight. Worse, they'd aligned themselves with the invaders. Terror gripped Jerusalem's ruler. Gibeon wasn't some minor outpost. It was a royal city, strategically located, militarily significant. Its defection weakened the entire southern defense network. Adoni-Zedek sent urgent messages to four neighboring kings, Hoham of Hebron, Piram of Jarmuth, Japhia of Lachish, Debir of Eglon. Come help me attack Gibeon. They've made peace with Joshua and the invaders. 5 Amorite armies mobilized. They marched on Gibeon, surrounding the city, launching their assault. The target wasn't just Gibeon, it was the alliance itself. Destroy the treaty city and send a message. Cooperation with the invaders means annihilation. The Gibeonites sent runners to Gilgal. Don't abandon your servants. Come quickly. Save us. All the Amorite kings from the hill country have united against us. Joshua faced a choice. These were the same people who deceived him. The treaty came through fraud. He could have argued that deception voided the obligation. He could have let Gibeon face the consequences of their manipulation. Instead, he mobilized the army. The Lord's word came clear. Don't fear them. I've given them into your hand. Not one will stand before you. Joshua marched all night from Gilgal, 15 miles uphill in darkness. His entire force moved with him, including his best fighting men. They arrived at dawn, catching the coalition armies by surprise. The Lord threw the enemy into confusion. The battle became a rout at Gibeon, with Israel pursuing the fleeing forces up the ascent of Beth Horon. The retreat turned into carnage as panic spread through the coalition ranks. Then the sky joined the battle. Large hailstones fell from heaven as the fleeing armies descended toward Azekah and Makkedah. The stones struck with lethal force. More warriors died from the hailstones than from Israelite swords. The natural world itself seemed to fight against Canaan's defenders. Still the battle raged. Daylight was fading. Joshua needed more time to complete the victory. The enemy was scattered but not destroyed. Darkness would allow survivors to regroup, rebuild, return stronger. This moment demanded decisive action. Joshua spoke to the Lord in the presence of the entire army. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Aijalon. The sun stopped moving, the moon stood motionless. The nation continued its vengeance while the heavens obeyed the commander's voice. The sun halted in mid-sky, refusing to set for approximately a full day. Never before and never since has there been a day when the Lord listened to a human voice like this, because the Lord fought for the covenant people. The extended daylight allowed complete victory. No survivors escaped to tell their kings' families what happened. No remnant regrouped to threaten again. The coalition was utterly broken. Meanwhile, the 5 kings who'd organized this attack fled in panic. They found a cave at Makkedah and hid inside, hoping to escape notice in the chaos. Someone reported their location to Joshua. His response was practical. Roll large rocks against the cave mouth. Post guards. But don't let this slow the pursuit. Keep chasing the enemy. Cut off their retreat to their cities. The Lord has given them into your hand. The fighting continued until the slaughter was complete. A few survivors managed to reach fortified cities, but the armies were destroyed. The entire force returned to Joshua at Makkedah without incident. No one even raised a voice against any of the people. Then Joshua dealt with the kings. Open the cave, bring out those 5 kings. They dragged them into daylight, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. Defeated rulers who'd launched this coalition now stood humiliated before the army they'd sought to crush. Joshua called his military commanders forward. "Put your feet on the necks of these kings." They did so, a symbolic act of total victory, absolute dominance. The gesture communicated complete subjugation, the reversal of power, the triumph of the covenant people over those who opposed the divine plan. Then Joshua addressed his troops. "Don't be afraid or discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all your enemies." He struck down the 5 kings, then hung their bodies on 5 trees until evening. At sunset, following the law's requirement, he ordered the corpses cut down and thrown back into the cave where they'd hidden. Large rocks sealed the entrance, another memorial, another witness to divine faithfulness. The southern campaign continued. Joshua moved against each rebel city systematically. Makkedah first, the king and every person utterly destroyed, just as Jericho had been. Then Libnah, with the same result. Lachish fell after 2 days of siege. When Gezer's king came to help Lachish, Joshua defeated him too, leaving no survivors. Eglon lasted 1 day. Hebron and Debir followed. By campaign's end, the entire southern region submitted. The hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, the mountain slopes. Every kingdom fell. Every king died. No survivors escaped. Joshua devoted everything that breathed to destruction, exactly as the Lord commanded. The text summarizes the sweep, from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, from the whole Goshen region to Gibeon. All these kings and their lands conquered in one campaign. Why? Because the Lord fought for his people. Then the army returned to Gilgal. The extended daylight remains the most striking element of this narrative. Multiple explanations have been offered through centuries: astronomical phenomena, poetic language, miraculous intervention, localized effects. The text itself treats it as a unique event, unprecedented and unrepeated. There has been no day like it before or since. What matters narratively is what it signified: divine power engaged on behalf of the covenant people, responding to their leader's voice, extending resources to complete the mission. Whether through stopping Earth's rotation, through optical effects, through extended twilight, or through means beyond current understanding, the day lengthened. The battle reached its conclusion. The enemy found no refuge in darkness. The hailstones, too, showed nature weaponized for covenant purposes. Not random weather, but precise targeting, falling on fleeing enemies more lethal than the pursuing army. The sky itself became archer, warrior, judge. Gibeon's rescue demonstrated covenant faithfulness. Despite the fraudulent treaty, despite legitimate grievances about the deception, Joshua honored his oath. The Gibeonites' fear of divine promise had led them to trickery. But once covenant was established, protection followed. The invading kings who sought to punish Gibeon for their alliance met destruction instead. The 5 kings' deaths carried symbolic weight. These were the primary rulers of southern Canaan's defensive coalition. Their elimination left a power vacuum. Their cities' populations were destroyed. The entire southern region's military capacity was broken in a single campaign. The memorial caves at Achor with Achan, at Ai with the king, at Makkedah with 5 kings marked stages of conquest. Each heap of stones told a story. Each sealed entrance witnessed divine faithfulness. Geography became theology. Landmarks taught lessons. The extended day also reinforced Joshua's authority. Moses had performed signs at Egypt. Now Joshua commanded celestial bodies. Different miracles, but the same underlying reality: the Lord's presence with his appointed leader. Doubts about Joshua's ability to fill Moses' sandals dissolved in the face of such divine confirmation. The Southern Coalition's defeat opened the region for settlement. The hill country, the valleys, the coastal approaches, all now accessible. The early victories at Jericho and Ai had secured footholds. The Gibeonite treaty had created an ally in the central highlands. Now the southern kingdoms lay in ruins, their resistance crushed, their territories available. Yet the text notes something subtle. Joshua returned to Gilgal, not to settle in conquered territory, but to base camp. The pattern continued: strike, victory, return. No permanent occupation yet. The military phase still held priority. Consolidation would come later. The narrative was building toward climax. Jordan crossed, Jericho fallen, Ai conquered, alliance managed, Southern Coalition destroyed. The northern kingdoms remained, but momentum clearly favored the covenant people. Victory followed victory. Territory opened. Resistance collapsed before the advancing forces and their divine backing. The Northern Campaign, conquest at the waters of Merom. News of the southern collapse traveled north. King Jebin of Hazor heard what happened to the Five Kingdom Coalition. He understood the implications. The southern defensive network was gone. If the invaders weren't stopped in the north, nothing would remain. Jabin sent messages throughout the northern territories, to Jobab of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Akshaph, to rulers in the northern mountains, the Arabah south of Kinnereth, the western foothills, and Naphoth Dor. The message went out to Canaanites east and west, to Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites in the hill country, to Hivites below Mount Hermon in the Mizpah region. The response was overwhelming. Armies gathered, massive forces with warriors numerous as sand on the seashore, infantry, cavalry, and most importantly, war chariots, many war chariots. These represented advanced military technology, iron machines that could devastate foot soldiers, mobile platforms that gave northern forces a tactical edge the southern kingdoms lacked. They assembled at the waters of Merom, pooling their strength for one decisive confrontation. The logic was sound. Concentrate overwhelming force, exploit technological superiority, crush the invaders before they could advance further. United, they might accomplish what divided kingdoms could not. The Lord spoke to Joshua, "Don't fear them. By this time tomorrow, I will hand all of them over, slain before the people, hamstring their horses, burn their chariots." The instruction was specific. Don't just defeat them, disable their military capacity. The horses weren't to be kept as war assets. The chariots weren't to be captured and integrated into Israelite forces. Everything was to be destroyed, rendered permanently unusable. Joshua moved quickly. His entire fighting force advanced to the waters of Merom, launching a surprise assault against the assembled coalition. The timing caught the northern armies off guard. They'd gathered but hadn't yet organized for battle. The moment of vulnerability became the moment of attack. The Lord handed them over. The battle turned into a rout as panic spread through the coalition ranks. Israel pursued the fleeing forces in multiple directions, northwest to Greater Sidon, northeast to Misrephoth Maim, east to the valley of Mizpah. The coordinated Northern Alliance disintegrated into scattered refugees racing for any available shelter. Israel struck them down systematically. No survivors escaped to regroup and rebuild. The massive army that had seemed so formidable dissolved under the assault, its technological advantages neutralized by surprise and divine intervention. Joshua followed his instructions precisely. Every horse was hamstrung, tendons cut, rendering them permanently lame, unable to pull chariots or carry warriors. Every war chariot was burned, expensive military equipment reduced to ash and twisted metal. The Northern Coalition's technological edge disappeared in flames and surgical strikes against animal mobility. Then Joshua turned back to Hazor. Hazor was the head of all these kingdoms, the political center, the military coordinator, the city whose king had organized this entire resistance. Joshua captured it and struck down its king with the sword. Every person in the city was devoted to destruction. Nothing that breathed remained. Then he burned Hazor to the ground. This detail stands out. Most conquered cities weren't burned. Their structures were preserved for future use. But Hazor received special treatment. The flames that consumed it sent a message. The center of northern resistance was gone. The city that had coordinated opposition was reduced to ruins. Joshua captured all the royal cities and their kings. He struck them down with a sword, devoting them entirely to destruction as Moses had commanded. But apart from Hazor, none of these cities standing on their mounds were burned. The distinction was strategic. Preserve infrastructure while eliminating population, maintain defensive positions while removing resistance. All the plunder and livestock from these cities went to the Israelites. But every human being was struck down until they were destroyed. No one was left breathing. The pattern established at Jericho continued through the northern campaign. Complete removal of the population, total victory over opposition. The text emphasizes Joshua's obedience. As the Lord commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. The chain of command held firm. Divine instruction passed through Moses, reached execution through Joshua. No deviations, no modifications, complete compliance. The northern campaign required different tactics than the southern battles. The southern coalition had been drawn out by the Gibeon situation. They came to Joshua's allies, forcing a defensive response that turned into offensive victory. The northern coalition gathered deliberately, choosing their ground, maximizing their advantages. Joshua's surprise attack neutralized the chariot advantage. Chariots needed open ground and room to maneuver. A sudden assault before proper deployment turned sophisticated military equipment into liability. The horses and vehicles became targets rather than weapons, obstacles rather than advantages. The hamstringing of horses reveals something about the conquest's nature. These weren't battles fought for territorial expansion in the typical sense, amassing military power, building imperial capacity, accumulating resources for future campaigns. The divine instructions consistently prevented Israel from building conventional military strength. No chariot corps, no cavalry division, no advanced weaponry integration. This pattern extended throughout Joshua's leadership. The walls of Jericho fell without siege equipment. Ai fell through ambush rather than superior force. Gibeon was rescued through rapid night march rather than fortified positions. The Southern coalition was broken through hailstones and extended daylight rather than tactical genius alone. Now the Northern forces fell through surprise and hamstringing rather than chariot versus chariot warfare. The message was consistent. Victory comes through divine intervention, not military superiority. Dependence on the Lord outweighs dependence on technology. Trust in promises proves more reliable than trust in iron wheels and warhorse strength. Hazor's burning carried symbolic weight beyond military necessity. This was the head city, the organizing center, the place where resistance coalesced. Its destruction declared the end of coordinated northern opposition. Individual cities might remain, pockets of resistance might linger, but the unified front was shattered. The preservation of other cities showed practical wisdom. Infrastructure had value. Defensive walls, buildings, storage facilities. These would serve the incoming population. Only Hazor, as the symbolic center of rebellion against the divine plan, required complete destruction. The text notes Joshua fought against these kings a long time. The northern campaign wasn't a single battle. It involved multiple engagements, various cities, different tactical situations. The coalition was broken at Merom, but consolidating victory required sustained effort. Each city needed attention. Each stronghold needed securing. The systematic nature of the conquest becomes clear. Southern region first, then northern territories, moving methodically through the land. Not random raiding or opportunistic attacking, but organized progression. Each phase built on previous victories. Each campaign expanded the secured territory. Yet even with all these victories, the text will later acknowledge that very much land remains to be possessed. The major coalitions were broken. The primary cities were conquered. The organized resistance was shattered. But complete occupation was an ongoing process, not a single achievement. The Northern Campaign marked the end of major military operations during Joshua's active leadership. After Merom, the focus shifted from conquest to distribution, from fighting to settling, from taking territory to allocating it among tribes. The sword would be laid down, the surveyor's tools picked up. The waters of Merom became another landmark in the conquest narrative, a place where technological superiority met divine intervention and lost, where the largest coalition assembled and fell, where the northern kingdom's last coordinated resistance collapsed. Like Gibeon with its long day, like Jericho with its fallen walls, Merom testified that the Lord fought for his people. The burning chariots sent smoke signals visible for miles. Every northern city watching from distant walls saw the same message. Advanced weaponry means nothing against divine purpose. Superior technology cannot compensate for opposing the covenant plan. Iron wheels and trained war horses fall before faith and obedience. Joshua's forces returned from pursuit with complete victory. The northern territories lay open. The path to settlement was clear. The military phase was reaching its conclusion. What remained was organization, dividing the conquered land, establishing tribal boundaries, creating the infrastructure for permanent habitation. The divided land, Joshua the allotment administrator. The fighting stopped. The major coalitions were broken. 31 kings had fallen, their kingdoms conquered, their armies destroyed, their cities captured. The land had rest from war. Joshua had grown old. The years showed in his aging body. The Lord spoke to him directly about it. You are very old, and very much land remains to be possessed. What followed was an extensive description of territories still unconquered. Philistine regions along the coast, Jeshurite and Maacathite areas in the north, various pockets throughout the promised boundaries. The military victories had been decisive but not comprehensive. Complete occupation would require generations, not just Joshua's lifetime. But the time had come to divide what was conquered. The Lord gave specific instructions: distribute this land as an inheritance among the 9 tribes and half of Manasseh. 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, had already received their inheritance east of the Jordan, territories conquered under Moses' leadership. The western lands would go to the remaining tribes. The division process was complex. It required accurate surveying, fair allocation, consideration of tribal sizes, respect for historical precedents, and divine guidance through the sacred lots. Joshua established his base at Shiloh, where the tent of meeting was set up. This became the administrative center for land distribution. Caleb came forward first. Now 85 years old, he reminded Joshua of the promise made 45 years earlier at Kadesh Barnea. When the 12 spies returned from surveying the land, only Caleb and Joshua brought back a report of faith rather than fear. Moses had sworn that day, "The land your feet walked on will be your inheritance." Caleb asked for the hill country, specifically the region around Hebron where the Anakites lived, the giants who had terrified the other spies. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. Give me this hill country the Lord promised. Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, as his inheritance. The old warrior went up and drove out the 3 Anakite clans from the city. Faith that sustained him through 40 years of wilderness waiting now powered him to claim his inheritance despite the presence of giants. The allocation continued tribe by tribe. Judah received extensive territory in the south, detailed boundary descriptions, lists of cities, specifications about what was conquered and what remained. The account notes that Judah couldn't dislodge the Jebusites from Jerusalem, who remained there to this day. Complete possession wasn't achieved everywhere. Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 Joseph tribes, received central territory, but they complained it wasn't enough. "Why have you given us only one allotment when we're so numerous?" Joshua responded practically. "If you're so numerous and the hill country of Ephraim is too small, go up to the forest and clear land there. If the hill country isn't enough, expand downward, even if the Canaanites in the valleys have iron chariots." The answer revealed his leadership philosophy. Don't complain about limitations. Work with what you have. Expand through effort. Trust divine promises about overcoming obstacles. The presence of iron chariots shouldn't paralyze. It should motivate dependence on the same God who stopped the sun and scattered coalitions. 7 tribes remained without allocated inheritance. They'd been slow to claim their portions, passive about taking possession. Joshua challenged them directly. How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land the Lord has given you? He organized a systematic survey. Each tribe appointed 3 men. These surveying teams went through the remaining territory, making a written description of the land with its towns, dividing it into 7 parts. They brought the documentation back to Joshua at Shiloh. Then Joshua cast lots before the Lord. The sacred process determined which tribe received which territory. Benjamin's portion fell between Judah and Ephraim. Simeon received territory within Judah's allocation. Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan each received their designated portions. The text provides extensive detail, boundary markers, cities included, geographical features, neighboring territories. Reading through these chapters feels tedious, but the precision served important purposes. Clear boundaries prevented disputes. Written records established permanent claims. Detailed specifications ensured each tribe understood exactly what belonged to them. Dan's territory presented challenges. The Amorites confined them to the hill country, not allowing them access to the plain. Dan's inheritance was too small for their numbers. Eventually, they migrated north and captured Leshem, settling there and renaming it Dan. But this happened later. The initial allocation was difficult from the start. After all the tribal distributions were complete, the people gave Joshua his own inheritance. He asked for Timnath Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. They gave it to him, and he built up the city and settled there. The leader who distributed the land received his portion last, choosing modestly rather than claiming the best territory for himself. The administrative work required different skills than military command: patience with complaints, attention to detail, fair judgment in disputes, diplomatic handling of tribal rivalries, wisdom in solving problems like the Joseph tribe's land shortage, firmness in challenging the 7 tribes' passivity. Joshua demonstrated capability in both roles: warrior and administrator, commander and judge, military leader, and civil organizer. The transition from conquest to settlement required adapting leadership style while maintaining the same dependence on divine guidance. The lot casting ensured that human favoritism didn't determine allocations. The sacred process removed Joshua from accusations of bias. Uh, each tribe received what divine providence designated. This method had ancient precedent. It was how Achan was identified, how decisions were made when human wisdom reached its limits.